Howdy folks, it's me, Josh. The year is 1912, and after stepping down as president 3 years prior, Theodore Roosevelt decided that he was fed up with the subsequent Taft administration and ran for a non-consecutive, what many called, third term under his new Progressive Party. However, while campaigning, he would end up being shot while about to give a speech, though fortunately managed to survive. But his presence as a third-party candidate would end up splitting the Republican vote, handing the election to Woodrow Wilson. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Theodore Roosevelt was assassinated? So first, we need to understand a bit about the situation that the Republican Party was facing back during this election. After Taft's election in 1908, the Republican Party began to divide into two camps. On the one hand were the progressives, largely led by Roosevelt, as well as his sidekick Robert La Follette, and on the other hand were the conservatives, led by Taft, who, in reality, was more so just a moderate progressive. The two camps repeatedly butt heads over numerous issues. For instance, trade policy, in which the conservatives pushed for high tariffs to promote American industry, while the progressives pushed for lower tariffs, arguing that high rates promoted monopolies. And then there was the antitrust issue, in which Taft was way more aggressive than Roosevelt in breaking up trusts, attempting to break some that Roosevelt didn't want to be broken, such as U.S. Steel. And then there was the judiciary, in which, due to the Supreme Court stifling many progressive reforms, many progressives began to push for judicial decisions to be subject to popular vote, with conservatives seeing this as an outright affront and threat to the Constitution. So, over time, the progressives and conservatives continued to clash within the Republican Party, and by the 1912 election, Roosevelt's sidekick, La Follette, decided to try to challenge Taft for the Republican nomination. Roosevelt initially didn't want to run, but as more and more people began pushing him to do so, he eventually started his own bid for the nomination. However, despite winning an outright majority of the primary votes, since most states still merely appointed their delegates without a vote, Taft still managed to win most of the delegates and thus won the nomination. Now, of course, Roosevelt was pissed about this, claiming that the nomination was stolen from him as he and his buddies walked out of the RNC and decided to have their own TeddyCon. And so, after TeddyCon, the election was left with three major candidates: Taft for the Republicans, Roosevelt for the Progressives, and some guy named Woodrow Wilson for the Democrats. And throughout the months leading up to the election, the fights between Taft and Roosevelt would keep getting even more heated. That is, until, on October 14th, 1912, after tracking him down and following him across the entire country for nearly a month, a man named John Schrank attempted to assassinate Roosevelt. Apparently, his motive for doing so was that he was visited by an apparition of William McKinley, who told him that Roosevelt had murdered him, and that he needed to do the same in order to prevent a third term. He was found not guilty on accounts of insanity. So, Schrank shot Roosevelt, but thanks to the bullet being slowed down by an eyeglass case and a 50-page speech, Roosevelt survived, and despite having literally just been shot, gave his speech anyways, saying it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. And so, a few weeks later, Election Day would roll around, and with the Republican vote split, Woodrow Wilson would end up winning the presidency as only the second Democrat to be elected in 56 years. But what if that changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, Theodore Roosevelt was assassinated? Now, let's assume that Roosevelt didn't have his eyeglass case and speech in that pocket, or perhaps the bullet just hit him somewhere else. In any case, without the protection that those things gave him, Roosevelt, as well as his presidential bid, would be immediately terminated. With Roosevelt gone, he would immediately be replaced at the top of the progressive ticket by his running mate, Hiram Johnson. But with Roosevelt dead, the Progressive Party would begin to fizzle out and die, as the primary force driving it forward was just taken out. And so, though Johnson would receive a significant vote share from the die-hard progressives, most would likely just fall back in line with the Republican Party, voting for Taft in the election, as he manages to secure a second term for himself. And so, just like that, Woodrow Wilson is never elected president, and Taft returns for his second term. Taft would continue his moderate progressive policies, maintaining the power of the judicial branch and still breaking up plenty of trusts. Meanwhile, he would also continue his policies of dollar diplomacy, using the American economy in order to gain influence over Latin America, though still using military intervention here and there. But not long after, the First World War would end up breaking out in Europe. In our timeline, Taft had initially supported Wilson's policies of neutrality, wanting to keep the US out of the war. But after numerous perceived German acts of aggression towards the United States, most notably the sinking of the Lusitania, Taft changed his tune and began to call for war. And so, this time, with Taft in office, after the sinking of the Lusitania, he would likely end up asking Congress for a declaration of war against Germany in 1915, several years earlier than in our timeline. And with Europe already locked in a war of attrition, and with the US throwing their support behind the Entente much sooner than in our timeline, this would give the Entente the much-needed boost in order to break through and defeat Germany much quicker, as the war doesn't drag on for nearly as long as it did in our timeline. And so, with the war over much sooner, and without Wilson there to issue his 13 points, the peace ends up looking dramatically different than in our timeline. Germany still loses Alsace-Lorraine to France, and Russia perhaps takes some land from Germany and Austria-Hungary, as well as the Ottoman Empire. Italy takes South Tyrol, and probably a few things here and there, and Germany still loses its colonies. But without the war taking as heavy of a toll on Europe, the old regimes that had been in place there for centuries remain intact, as the German, Russian, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires remain intact. Though the last two wouldn't last much longer. And without the destruction caused by the war, ideologies such as communism and fascism never end up rising, and without Germany being as humiliated, this would likely avoid a Second World War. Anyways, back to America. In our timeline, Taft had supported US entry into the League of Nations, and with him as the leader of the Republican Party, it's much more likely that the US would end up joining the League in this alternate timeline, which would help to ensure its lasting success into the future. Going into the 1916 election, Taft, after leading the US into such an immense success, would also be immensely popular. But there would still be divides in the Republican Party in the aftermath of the progressive split. In order to mend the divides, the Republicans would likely end up nominating another moderate progressive who could appease both wings of the party and continue Taft's work, perhaps seeing Charles Evans Hughes once again being nominated. And with the Republican Party in such a powerful position in the country, Hughes would easily see victory in the 1916 election. Without the chaos regarding the first Red Scare, progressive policies would continue on into the future as the US continues to see steady and stable economic growth, with things like the Great Depression likely never happening in this timeline. And so, as a result, Taft's plan for moderate progressivism continues on into the future as America, as well as Europe, continue to see stable prosperity. But how long this will last is a mystery. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to stick around for more. And hey, you could also maybe subscribe or something. So that's it for today's video. Well, till next time, see ya.